Namaskar. Welcome to Lock in Frame India, episode number 6 on Assam. Assam, which is representative of the idea of the microcosm of India, we take you on a journey in this webinar on the Brahmaputra. And to begin with, let's look at the Brahmaputra, which is perceived by the larger section of people in the massive Indian subcontinent from a Brahminical perspective as the son of Lord Brahma. Let us understand that the indigenous, the absolutely original people, how they have looked at Brahmaputra, not as a mythological god, but as an idea of the sound of nature. Look at this installation with which we enter the imagination to which the Brahmaputra lends itself. We come to the next section where we discuss that this particular webinar is anchored on Brahmaputra, but also the music of the iconic bard of Brahmaputra, the late Bhupen Hazarika. Let us hear the sound of his music, how he looks at Assam as a national identity on its own, having a negotiation with the larger idea of India.
महाबाहु ब्रह्मपुत्र महामिलनर तीर्थ कत युग धरि आइसे प्रकाशि समन्वयर अर्थ महाबाहु ब्रह्मपुत्र महामिलनर तीर्थ कत युग धरि आइसे प्रकाशि समन्वयर अर्थ
Brahmaputra, the multi-layered, multi-armed river, encompassing and is rooted in the idea of a controversial human behavior of migration. Let's look at the cultural geography and discover fascinating ways of entering in the COVID time the idea of India through Brahmaputra. In the next slide, what do we see? That the identity of Brahmaputra is both intra-national and international. And so it brings to us the idea of geopolitics. Tibet, which is China, India, and Bangladesh. And how this idea of Brahmaputra is defying the narrow idiom of political and geopolitics in terms of collective cultural mapping. And that is a continuity that we continue to travel as we look at Assam. But the idea, if we for one moment see Brahmaputra as a male concept, it is important to realize that the male concept is very much aligned to the female concept, which gets represented in the webinar through the idea of textiles. We see again the Bodo woman, for instance, aligning herself to the hills of Assam. In the next slide, we see the next section, we see Brahmaputra as the river of hopelessness as much as the river of hope. It brings together the idea of alluvial soil enriching in its flood as much as it brings displacement. When we travel, in the next slide, we begin traveling in the valley of Brahmaputra in Assam. We start our journey in Guwahati, where we come across all kinds of idioms of cultural expressions, and then we see weaving towns, handloom towns, and we come to Kaziranga, the politics of game and conservation of natural bounties. And from there, we go to the largest river island in the world, Majuli, and finally to the Upper Assam, where we go to Tinsukia. Let us begin our travel. So, we cannot understand, in the next slide we see, we cannot understand Assam with the Ahoms. Ahoms were the rulers of Assam from 13th to the 18th century, mid-19th century, first quarter of the 19th century. And the word Assam actually comes from their entity, Ahom. We will also stop at their identity of cultural geography in Shivsagar in the webinar. But how can we not talk about the center of the fulcrum of the woman energy, which is Kamakhya, the center of tantric thought? And how does that negotiation that the matriarchal and the women empowered of Northeast, that idea is negotiated, is conversed in the idea of Kamakhya. After Kamakhya, we will give a glimpse of the heritage of silk. Yes, it is not only about mulberry, it is about other silkworms, and the most important being Muga, which has the GI or the geographical protection specific to Assam, the strongest and a very beautiful silk. The more you wash, the greater tensile there is. From the world of silk, we move on to the world of biodiversity in Kaziranga, a template to understand conservation of environment and natural history in India. How does this get a history from the colonial times? What happens in terms of militarization? How do motifs of the rhino and certain other animals get imprinted in the collective memories, the lived memories of Assam? From Kaziranga, we then move on a ferry. Yes, a ferry. And the song of Bhupen Hazarika. What do we see? We arrive next to Majuli and we enter the world of the 1516 scholar, theatre person, spiritual leader, the world of Shankardev. Yes, we enter a world where we see dances, theaters, textiles, spiritual organization in this absolutely contested area called Majuli. In Majuli next, we see the Mishings. The Mishings are a second largest indigenous community of Assam. And what do they bring with them? Textiles and their own way of looking that yes, no great Brahminical order can populate their mind. Only one creator, and that is nature. How they live in synergy with nature. And from Mishing, we move right into the north to Tinsukia, where we meet the Santos, the people who gave tea, yes, chai, tea to the British. And today, chai is, we can't even get up without a chai. So keep listening to our stories of unknown, untold stories on India in COVID time, emerging realities. Yes, we now have, as a human species, a time for discovering an untold, silent world. Join us for the webinar. Hear us on. Thank you. With Navina Jafa, like our page as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel and be a part of our stories on India.